Hi everyone, it's Lindsay. Welcome back to another video. Today I'm going to be doing some scene making, but they're super easy with the help of stencils. The first stencil I'm using is new from the Crafters Workshop. It's called Cypress Tree, and I'm using it in the 6x6 form. So all the supplies, everything I'm using is all going to be listed and linked down in the description box below. So if you have any questions about ink colors or stencils or blending things that I'm using, head down there. You'll find the answers and you'll also find links to some of the places I like to go shopping to buy these things. The first thing I want to do with this stencil is kind of trace out where I need the ground and the sky to be. So I just placed my stencil over my cardstock panel and used a pencil just to lightly draw a line on the very top of those little mounds that were on the stencil. Now this is not a straight line. It wouldn't look right if I made this into a straight line. So to mask off the ground and the sky, I'm going to use painter's tape, but I'll be ripping it. Now, you cannot make this perfect. You just can't unless you go in with something like masking fluid and mask off the bottom of the paper that way. But I didn't want to take the time to do that. I wanted this to be more of a hand-drawn look. So I ripped the paper, got it as close as possible. There's going to be some white spots. There might even be some overlap. That's okay. It goes with the handmade look that I'm going for here. So I went ahead and masked off that bottom portion. Then I'm using some Catherine Pooler ink. It's a boy ink, and my Amazon blending brush to do some ink blending. I'm starting towards the bottom, towards that masking, and I'll go lighter as I go up towards the top. I want this fairly light. I don't want any heavy ink blending here. So once I have that masked, I can go ahead and peel off the bottom masking. Now I need to go ahead and mask from the top so I can do that bottom portion and do some ink blending down there. Now again, this isn't going to be perfect. There is no way that you can get this lined up completely straight. It is what it is. You can go in, you can do some creative masking. At this point, you couldn't even do your liquid masking because it would mess with your ink up top. But again, this is a really neat look, and it does have a little bit of white space, but I kind of like it. So on the bottom, I used some eucalyptus ink, lighter towards or darker towards the top, lighter towards the bottom. Then I peeled off all that masking tape, and it's time to do the ink blending through the stencil. So I put my stencil down onto my panel and taped it from the back, so I didn't have any tape marks on this whatsoever. And I know my paper is not going to move from my stencil. Now for this tree and the grass, I'm going to be using eucalyptus ink. Now I use this on the ink blending, but that's okay because with the ink blending, it goes on a little bit lighter. Then to get a darker tone, I go in with a sponge or a finger dauber in this case. You can use a makeup sponge or anything like that. The ink is going to go on heavier and thicker, therefore a darker color you're going to get with it. This is a great way to make scenes and do stenciling if you do not have a lot of inks. You can use the same ink over and over, but using these two different blending techniques, you're going to get different looks with it. So I did that eucalyptus on the bottom. Then I went ahead and switched over to one of my Amazon makeup blending brushes. This is one of those teeny tiny little circular brushes. And I'm using icing on the cake ink. This is going to help me get into all those tight little nooks and crannies where I need those branches and the base of the tree. And again, I want to go in with brown here, but these are very, very close to some of the leaves or the green parts of the trees, so I don't want that to mix. And that is where these itsy bitsy brushes come in so handy. You can really get into the fine details. Then I'll switch back to my finger dauber and go in with more of that eucalyptus ink in just the places on the top of the tree where I want that dark green ink. Now again, I already have some ink blending here, but in this case, it's a blue ink, and I went super light with it. So this green, the darker green, especially going in with that sponge dauber and really loading up that pigment, it's going to cover it just fine. You're not going to see anything through it. It's not going to change the shade of green or anything like that, especially if you let it dry in between like I did. I was working on the bottom. That top ink had some time to dry in between, so it's not going to do much mixing, if any at all. And again, these are dye inks. If you go in while it's wet, it will mix a little bit, so give that a little bit of time to dry. Now comes the fun part, taking off the stencil. I absolutely love this part. It's my favorite. And I love the big reveal. So here we go. You can see I do have a little bit of white space in between the grass and the sky. That's okay. I think it goes with the stenciled look of this. I love the way this one turned out. And to finish this card off, I kept it really super simple. I matted that panel with a craft cardstock mat, and then I went in and glued that mat and the panel down to an A2 top folding white card base. I've been using liquid adhesive to glue down my panels to my card bases. I find it much more economical than going in with your paper tape or tape runners or something like that. And it works really well. It holds together so good. Now, for my sentiment, I'm doing something I do a lot of times. I'm building up a die cut to make it much thicker and have some dimension. I'm using a prayers die cut from Hero Arts. I cut it 3 times from craft cardstock. Then I'll use some of that liquid adhesive and glue them all together. And then I can put it right down on the card base. I added the sending you right up there at the top that I used the icing on the cake ink to stamp that with, so everything coordinates. You can also see I added a little something there to that prayers die cut because when I put it down it wasn't standing out enough. I'll go into that later on in the video. Let's move on to the second card. For this, I am using the new Sunflower Meadow stencil, but first I need to go ahead and do some die cutting with the Cat Scrappiness Wood Grain Frame die cut. I die cut that from white cardstock once and then craft cardstock 3 times. I want the center of the white cardstock. The frame I can do without on this card. I'll save it for another card, but that center I'm going to start off doing some ink blending on. This is where my stenciling is going to be. I'm using a jumbo ink dauber here with some Skylight ink from Catherine Pooler. I'm going darker towards the bottom, lighter towards the top, not really even doing a whole lot of ink blending towards the top. Then I'll go ahead and line up that card panel or that white cardstock panel onto my Sunflower Meadow stencil and tape it to the back of that stencil. Now it's time to do some ink blending through the stencil. On this stencil, there are some parts that are super close together and almost impossible to get just that color in it. So one of the most used tools that I have for my stenciling when I do stenciling like this are these fantastic ink blenders, I guess you could call them. They're like little foam tipped pencils. You can get them in a rounded or you can get them in like a straight pointy form. I'm using one of the pointed ones today, but to be perfectly honest, the rounded ones work much better going through stencils. The pointed ones I find better for doing like chalk coloring or something like that. But what I like to do with these is dip them in my ink pad and go in those areas where I need just that color, but I don't want it to mix with another one. I don't do the whole ink blending with those. It would be too tedious. But those areas where it is so close to another color that needs to be ink blended on, I like to go in with some fine details with those fantastic tools. Then when I get all those filled in, I'll come in with a larger ink blending tool and fill in the rest of it just to make it go by a little bit quicker and not be so tedious. So I filled in all the leaves with eucalyptus ink. Then it was time to do the top of the sunflowers. So for this, I'm going back to those Amazon blending brushes. These are a really good deal. I will leave them linked down in the description box below. But you get like 10 brushes in this set, and some of them are super tiny. This is one I'm using right here. And it works so good blending these tiny little details on the stencil. Now I started off with the icing on the cake in the center. Then I'll go ahead and use some Sonnet ink around the icing on the cake. This is all going to blend together a little bit, which I love the look of. If you wanted to keep it more separate, you could go in with the Fantastics tool. You could even wipe off your stencil before you start blending with the other color. But I kind of like the look of it all blended together. So once I got the Sonnet ink on there, I left just the very tips of the sunflowers that I will be using some shea butter ink on. And I'll blend that right on the tips of those sunflowers. Again, I'm just using the same brush here. I'm not doing much cleaning off of it. your pads, your Catherine Pool ink pads don't get contaminated, so it's not really that big of a deal to be cleaning this off, especially when all the colors are going to end up being blended together anyway. Now my favorite part, pulling off the stencil, and I've got this gorgeous sunflower meadow ready to go on my card. I absolutely love sunflowers, so this one is a favorite of mine, and look at that. I love the blending on these. It worked out so well. So on to the rest of the card. The reason I cut the 3 craft frames is because I'm going to do the same technique I did with that prayers die cut. I'm going to build them up and create some dimension with them. So I went ahead and took one of the frames and glued it down under the card base. Then, just to make it easier on myself, I'm going to go ahead and inlay that sunflower panel now. It's much, much easier to inlay it into one die than it is to inlay it into stacked up dies. In case any of them are just a little bit off, go ahead and inlay it in the first die. Build up your next 2 dies, again just gluing them together with some liquid adhesive, and then place those 2 dies right over the other die that you've already glued down. It makes your life much easier than trying to inlay that panel into 3 different dies that are all stacked up on top of each other. I've tried to do it before. I'm always just a little bit off, so I find this way much easier. I also built up a thanks sentiment and glued that onto the panel along with a for your kindness sentiment strip to finish it off. Now here's the thing with my sentiments. They were from craft cardstock, and I felt like they both kind of got lost in the cards a little bit. So here's a little trick. What I did was I took some of this Irresistible, it's a Pico embellisher from Imagine. It's got a super fine tip on it. It never gets clogged because it comes with that tip that has like a needle on it, so it threads inside. It's not going to get clogged on you, but it's very liquidy. And it goes great over these sentiments, and it darkens them up a few shades, adds some dimension, not a ton, but it adds a ton of shine. It really helps your sentiments stand out if they're getting lost in the background, your die cut sentiments. So if you ever run into that problem, throw some of this on there and it works fabulous to really help it stand out from that background. Just a little tip if you're like me and you don't want to start your cards over. That is going to do it for me today. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. There are going to be links down in the description box below, so don't forget to check those out. If you haven't subscribed to my channel, you can also do that right here on this page. Happy crafting, everyone!